All right. I'm going to start with a tradition that I've learned at Salesforce. I've been working at Salesforce now about a year, and one part of the Salesforce culture that I really like is we always start our presentations off with gratitude. So let me start by thanking Julius Wee for giving me the opportunity to speak this morning, obviously evening my time. I want to thank my mentors. It hopefully is obvious already to all of you, or will be obvious to all of you, that I didn't come up with this out of thin air. I am indebted to many a mentor over the years. And then lastly, I want to thank you. This content all exists as a blog post I wrote on Medium, and I have never tried to present it as a presentation. So thank you for being my guinea pigs. And feel free to find me on LinkedIn and hit me up with any feedback at the end, critical or positive. I would love some ideas on how to make this content better as a presentation. It's kind of fun to be talking to Singapore in this exact February, because just a few weeks ago, my great grand boss, Mr. Mark Benioff, was in Singapore at the company kickoff, kind of getting us all fired up for the next year. Singapore is a place I have stopped through on the way to Kuala Lumpur, but I've never actually visited, and it looks lovely. I hope someday to visit. As you hopefully already know, my name is Chris Haag. I am one of the many VPs of software engineering at Salesforce. Thought I'd introduce myself just kind of briefly at the beginning. I've been working in Silicon Valley for more than 20 years. I've been leading people since about 2007. So that's 14 years, going on 14 years now. I spent most of the last 10 years doing product engineering at startups, building data science enabled products in the business to business space. I'm also a dad. I'm an amateur saxophone player, and you may hear my dog do some barking because this is COVID, and of course I'm at home. I thought I run a team of about 50 people. Here's a few of the members on my team. Among many things, we are focused on using data science and automation to plot a course that will enable Salesforce to run deliver our products on top not only of our own data centers, but at Amazon, at Azure, and at GCP. And doing it at a scale that will handle the scope of our business over the next coming decade. Our belief is that we can create basically fully autonomous capacity and cost management for my company. And it is I will say, a very interesting set of challenges. So before I get into managing high and low performers, I want to start by asking, why do we even pay attention to this? Why do we invest this time? Why do it at all? And before I answer that question, what is it even that we're talking about with working with high and low performers? Well, the category, at least as I've heard it described here in Silicon Valley, is performance management, meaning work we do as leaders to improve the performance of the individuals on our team and to improve the performance of our teams, with the goal of creating very high performance teams. And I thought it might be fun, before jumping into my content, to ask, how much time should we spend on performance management? Because we have a host of things that we need to stay on top of as leaders. How do we decide whether we're doing enough performance management or maybe too much? Well, I'm going to offer a mental model that I use to think about this question and questions like it. And I often find with mental models, it's helpful to start with boundary conditions. So in this case, when would I do no performance management? And maybe when would I do nothing but performance management? Well, say on the when would I do no performance management, I can think of two clear scenarios that have maybe sometimes happened in my experience where I'm not really doing any performance management. One example I will give, and this is a saying that I've heard, when the Titanic started to sink, the captain did not call a meeting. Similarly, if you're running a team and things are really, really not going well, probably performance management slips to the bottom of your priority list. You're just trying to dig yourself out of a hole. On a more positive note, I've also had the occasion to start a team from scratch and really hire people I've worked with for a long, long time, just the most senior, best people I know. Basically, creating a high-performance team that really doesn't need a lot of performance management. So there's one boundary condition. Is there ever a time I could imagine in my role as an engineering leader doing nothing but performance management? The answer is no. Like, you think about that list I put out there, you can't drop those things. So that maybe already starts to give me a sense that, like, if sometimes we do none of it and we'd never do 100% of it, probably the right amount is somewhere between 0 and, a quarter of our time. But so how much is enough? How much is too much? Well, of course, I'm going to tell you the answer is contextual, which I know isn't super helpful, but I'll try to give kind of one other way I think of this. A lot of what leaders do, especially in engineering and maybe in lots of other disciplines, is figure out that balance of tactical and strategic work. In product engineering, the balance between focusing on getting some change, some new feature, some product in the customer's hands, this sprint, this month, versus investing in work that will improve our ability to deliver high quality features to our customers next month. Basically, those investments in the future productivity is the classic go slow to go fast. In my experience, most of us tend to err on the side of doing too much to get, this sprint, this month's features out the door, and not enough time preparing to get faster and higher quality in the future. So while I can't tell you how much time you should be spending performance managing, I'm going to guess, those of you who are already people leaders, in my experience, you're probably not doing enough of it. In the same way that your teams are probably not doing enough refactoring, not doing enough test-driven development, not doing enough automation. So wherever you are, I would ask the question of whether maybe you should do a little more so you can be faster down the line. All right, let's get to the content. The first question becomes, why do we even need to worry about high performers, right? Like, they're high performers. They're already killing it. Maybe we could just fire and forget and not worry about it. And I will say, it's easy to get the temptation of saying, why can't they all be high performers? Fortunately, honestly, if they were all high performers, companies wouldn't really need us as much. So maybe it's good that they're not all high performers. It also raises the question, how do we know that they are high performers? Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. First off, experience helps. The more time you spend in this profession, the more time you spend leading people, you will find that you develop an intuitive sense of who's high performing and who isn't. Unfortunately, that's not good enough. You need to have some specific reasons for why you believe your high performers are high performing, both to coach them, because you need specifics, but also, most places you work will have a somewhat structured promotion process, and it's not going to really fly to go and say, I just feel that they're high performers. Well, so all right, how do we do this? Well, let's talk about having a mental model, some framework for thinking this through. First off, performance is always going to be relative to the level of the employee. Obviously, our expectations for a new college grad or a high-performing new college grad are going to be very different than our expectations for a senior engineer who is high performing. So what I recommend, if you haven't already done this, and if you're at a startup, you may not have, carve out the time, get your team together, and as a group, think through what makes us unique. What is unique about this group of people, and what is unique about the mission we're on as a company? And what does that say about what we value as an engineering team? And what are the specific skills, both technical and soft skills, that we want to have as a team? Just doing this exercise is admittedly taking you away from delivering product, but go slow to go fast. This exercise will have immediate benefits. It will let all of your existing team members kind of self-assess. Where could they grow? Where could they learn from their colleagues? You can also use it in recruiting. Once you've got all this written down, your job descriptions get a lot easier. And during interviews, having this written down is a great way to structure your interview process so you make sure you don't duplicate questions and technical areas, but also make sure you cover them all. Once you've got your values and your competencies defined, then you've got, I will admit, a somewhat tedious task of defining your expectations for each level of employee. For those of you working at large companies, certainly including Salesforce, someone's already done this for me. We have an incredibly detailed and I think really well-written set of expectations across like 8 different dimensions for I think 6 different levels. But I will say at startups, I have always had just 4, or maybe 1. We eventually added a 5th for like principal engineers who were out talking at conferences. It takes some time. But as you will see, I will keep coming back to this notion of expectations per level, doing the exercise and getting buy-in from the team and from maybe the leadership group will really, really serve you well in working with employees of all levels, both high, low, and everything in between. Another part of your mental model is the classic potential and performance. You need to think about how are they executing relative to your expectations for their level. That's part of your performance evaluation. And then your understanding of potential. You know, once you've gotten things written down, hopefully ability to execute at level is, if not truly objective, at least something that you can kind of create specific examples of. You know, I expect a level 2 engineer to be able to define an epic in a way that more junior engineers can start to work tasks. And then if someone is struggling, you can say, that doesn't seem like something you can do. Or if you have a new college grad who's already able to do that, you can say, wow, you seem high performing, right? You're performing above our expectations for your level. A brief note about potential. That is a little harder to kind of explain, but at least it's a little fuzzier. But generally, I look for the employees who are out, reading blogs, bringing new ideas to the team, employees who are asking for mentors, employees who are, have that resiliency and that grit, who can have a failure and keep going. Potential is harder to measure, but well worth, thinking through and having an opinion of. Sorry, I'm trying to keep a timer going and it dropped on me. All right, let's think about motivation for high performers. And obviously, a lot of the content I'm going to give about high performers applies to performers of all types. And you might think, wow, well, if it's a high performer, why should I worry about their motivation? In my experience, though, actually, it's very important to check in with your high performers. So let's talk about motivation. Hopefully some of you are familiar with Dan Pink's work. If not, I've got a link here and I think I'll be able to send the slides out later. He makes a distinction between extrinsic motivators, things like salary, bonus, recognition, having someone praise. These are all extrinsic motivators, and they're nice, but they don't really last. They tend to kind of, they're kind of like empty calories. They're like a sugar high. Whereas intrinsic motivators, this is how we motivate ourselves. And as a leader, you really want to make sure that you are providing opportunities for everyone on your team, but in particular your high performers, to find purpose, mastery, and autonomy. Purpose defined as that mission. Like, why are we doing this work? What impact am I having? What impact is the team having? What impact is the company having? Am I engaged in it? Can you engage your team in it? The other thing that motivates all of us is learning. Humans are relatively weak when it comes to superpowers. We can't run 70 miles an hour like a cheetah. We can't fly through the air like a bird. But boy, one thing we can do is learn. And this tends to be motivating for most people. So making sure that your culture and the way you structure your teams gives people a chance to learn is super important. And then lastly, the last one is don't micromanage. Make sure your employees, relative to their levels, have a chance to exercise some autonomy and make their own decisions. It's also worth being on the lookout for unhealthy motivators, especially with your high performers. Now, these first two can come in positive forms, but I want to call out with both recognition and winning that when they become someone's purpose, when they become why someone, really, really important to one of your high performers in particular, this can really flip them into being a problem and maybe even arguably a low performer. With recognition, it's when that search to be praised starts to outweigh their commitment to the business and the team. Signs of this include kind of maybe almost sort of stealing credit from others, or taking on more than they can handle because they want that recognition. Winning can be a great thing. We all have a sense of competition. We're certainly competing with our business competition. But where winning can go off the rails is when, especially for engineers, when they start to approach a technical discussion with the feeling that they need to win that discussion. That if their idea, if their design doesn't carry the day, they've lost. This can really become a problem, right? You get someone who speaks over others, who doesn't listen, who doesn't build consensus. This can really flip someone and can become an example of one of my favorite quotes, which is, I'd rather have a hole on my team than an asshole. Fear, anxiety, and never enough is I'll end with, this is the most common unhealthy motivator I see, especially in my top performers. And this is where you have an employee who needs external validation that they're doing okay. And the way they get that external validation is through their job. This will cause them to be very deeply identified with their work, will make them very sensitive to criticism, and will also make them very likely to burn out. These type of high performers will often leave you because they'll set themselves up in a situation where they can't keep up with all of their commitments. They feel burnt out. They feel like they're letting people down. They get a job offer, they leave because they think the grass is going to be greener. But what do you know? They will go to that new job and they will recreate the same situation that they were in at your job. As their manager, you want to try to identify this and help them see that their personal value isn't necessarily tied to those outcomes. You'll need to reassure them and help them find, a different sense of ideally intrinsic. You'll notice that these unhealthy motivators are all extrinsic, a more healthy intrinsic motivation. And then just briefly on the high performers, here are some common challenges that I have seen with my high performers. They often have been they've been so good, so talented that they have not had to learn to prioritize till they reach a certain level in their career. They tend to not to like to say no. Again, back to that fear anxiety approach to our work. So you need to teach them how to prioritize and teach them to be comfortable and indeed teach them the importance of saying no. Do not let them get bored. They'll leave you in a heartbeat. Lastly, you do want to recognize them. I know I've said that's extrinsic, and it is, but especially with high performers, they want to know that you recognize that they're high performing. So, this is where actually some intrinsic motivators are super useful. Spot bonuses, stock grants, just company recognition. If your CEO has some kind of thing where they recognize employees every quarter, this is a great way. Make sure that your high performers know that you recognize what they are bringing and that they are appreciated. All right, let's move on to managing low performers. Let me just start by saying none of us want to do this. I mean, unless, I guess some percentage of the population is, has some sort of psychopathic tendency, but for all of us who don't suffer from that disorder, managing low performers is really hard. And a lot of this talk will be about what to do when you have to give up on someone. And the reason I structure this talk on that is that managing someone out is the worst part of the job, and it's something none of us want to do. And so I really feel like it's important to talk about it and learn from each other and try to learn how to get through it. But I want to first acknowledge that none of us want to do this, and everyone that I hire, everyone that I work with, will avoid this as much as possible. But you don't want to avoid it completely, because if you're running a team long enough, it's going to happen. You're going to need to let somebody go. And if you are the type of leader who never does that, you're going to find that that's an anti-pattern and will have negative consequences for your team, your company, and your own career. And in some cases, for the person that you're the low performer themselves. One of my favorite interview questions is to try to get at, does this manager of engineering have a structured approach to this very vexing question? And I will tell you, when I ask this question, most times the answer I get is pretty much made up on the spot. So I would encourage you, those of you who are in leadership or are thinking of moving towards leadership, to start thinking about this. And of course, a lot of the rest of this presentation is giving you a way to think about it. And as always, I like a mental model, and I start with a boundary condition. I have worked at companies where you basically have to do something criminal or be verbally abusive or be completely derelict in your duties to ever risk being fired. If that's one boundary condition here, the other might be Netflix. Famously, they at least have had in the past a approach to performance management, which is basically good enough is goodbye. I will say I'm not comfortable with either of these. They feel a little extreme. So the questions become, how do we find that kind of middle path? How do we find that middle road? Well, I'm going to suggest three paradigms. And my point isn't that you all should use one of these paradigms. What I'm hoping is that they'll trigger your own thinking so you can create your own approach. If nothing else, if you're ever interviewing with me, you'll be ready for my interview question. But also, as managers, we are accountable. And I will say, for much of my career, when I have a boss tell me I'm accountable for something, I think that means something kind of bad. But actually, the dictionary definition of accountable is just that you can't make willy-nilly or just random decisions. You need to be able to explain yourself. And even if you've made a mistake, and mistakes happen, given that you've thought through you've got a mental model that will allow you to tweak your mental model based on that mistake. This is certainly the definition of accountability I use with my own team. So, all right, let's start with the simplest model I'm going to offer towards thinking about when to give up on a low performer. And that's just, again, back to those level specific expectations that you've hopefully already created. If you've got someone who is underperforming them, it ought to be possible, at least subjectively, to kind of track their progress towards raising their level so they can meet those expectations. And, obviously, if at some point you don't see the lines converge, that maybe is one way to go, well, all right, we need to move on to the performance improvement plan and, some real hard conversations. A slightly more complicated model that sort of builds on the previous one is the classic performance and potential 2x2. Obviously, if you have someone in the lower left quadrant and they don't show you any signs that they can move out of this, again, relative to level, that may kind of make your mind up for you. The way I tend to approach this is that I need to balance the needs of the individual, the team, and the company. And to me, that feels a little different than my role as a father or as a son. Within a family, right? No one is ever left behind. But in a team, especially a professional sports team that's trying to compete, sometimes you've got to make hard decisions. And that's because sometimes the interests of the person and the team, the company, are not aligned. And that's when you have to make kind of hard decisions. This model is nicely tunable to the level of the employee and just your own preferences. Obviously, one way you can think about this is if someone is just consistently dragging down the performance of the team, and again, with coaching, with help, with mentors, you don't see that they're on a trend towards at least adequate performance that doesn't decrease the overall team's ability to execute, that maybe is a time to shift gears. And that's actually honestly how I would approach a more junior employee. For my architect level employees, I have as one of my expectations explicitly that they are making the team better, that they are raising the game of the team. That's obviously a much higher expectation, but it's also a much higher level within the company. And if I have an architect who is not able to communicate well and build consensus and teach and mentor, that may lead to some challenging conversations with that architect. Another kind of tweak on this comes from American baseball, although for all I know, other sports are tracking a similar metric. In baseball, they actually track if I were to go on the open market and just hire a veteran, what would their likely impact on hits per game and errors and catches? Especially if you're in a team that's growing, you probably have a sense of whether the performance of one of your existing, let's say 3 or 4 year past college employees, how that might map to what would happen if you were to go hire someone just from externally. And if your conclusion is that external person would just be a clearly stronger performer, again, that's just a great place to start a conversation with that struggling employee. We're all, especially now, part of a global competition for jobs, and you're not doing them any favors if you don't let them know, hey dude, it feels to me like if I were to go hire a replacement, they would come in able to do some of the things that you're struggling with. How can we support you to raise your game? All right, couple last things. My second to last slide comes from a wonderful book that I will recommend to all of you called Radical Candor. And from my own experience, you will find, even after you've used your framework and you've said, you know what, I got to shift to managing this person out, you will make excuses to not fire them. I'll talk through my version of 4 of these. And these are all excuses I've heard from people, peers of mine or managers on my own team. Excuse me. First one is that you're always like, they're going to get better. There's that one thing they do really well, or, that one person says really nice things about them. I would encourage you in this case, go back to those expectations, be honest with yourself and the employee. Like, don't let the notion that they'll get there somewhere talk you out of doing the right thing for the team and the company. And as I've said earlier, you're not really doing the employee any favors either. They need to know this. They need to know this feedback. Probably one of the most common I hear from managers I work with is, well, yes, Joe is a low performer, but it's better than not having anybody. This one I really disagree with. Most of us are trying to develop complex adaptive systems that really only work when they're well architected and well engineered. And the demands on our systems and the criticality of our systems and the number of aspects of just human life software engineered systems touch are only growing. And having a low performer on your team is basically tech debt. And indeed, I think what you will find is that a low performer can kind of muddy your understanding of what it's going to take to improve the performance of the team as a whole. And whereas working through the performance improvement plan and having a hole on your team is actually clarifying. It will help you understand what you really need, what skills, what level. Don't let someone's better than nobody talk you out of this. Sometimes what a low performer needs is a new role, right? They're just in the wrong role. And that can be a wonderful outcome. That can be one of those times when we have a really positive ending working with a low performer. Just be on the lookout for someone who's constantly changing roles. That's an anti-pattern, and don't be the manager that passes this person on, right? And then another common concern that I hear and that I've had is that, well, if I fire somebody, it's going to freak everybody out. It's going to be bad for morale. Well, I will tell you my own experience. Assuming you've done this in a structured way, you've invested in this low performer, you've given them every benefit of the doubt. My experience is that literally the opposite of this is true. The feedback I get from my team has almost universally been, thank you. I like working at a company that has high standards, and I like being on a high performing team. I'll finish with, make sure you acknowledge to yourself, as Mark Andreessen said, the hard thing about hard things. This is one of the hard things. You need to be intentional about processing your own emotions because you're going to have them. And if you don't give yourself the headspace, if you don't take time to meditate or exercise or take your dogs for a walk or do your hobby or I don't know, have a glass of wine in the evening and talk it over with a friend or your spouse, you're going to find that your job is much harder and that you could burn out. And also you'll find that it's harder to have compassion. And you want to find a place to acknowledge that while, even though this person maybe isn't right for your team, they are still a valuable human. And we should have compassion for them. And that is my last slide. I'm really looking forward to your questions, and I want to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.